we knew the exact tone that we wanted it to be. And Carl Reiner said to me, he said, you can establish the tone of the movie in the first 2 minutes, and you can tell the audience what the rules are and how far you're willing to go. And that's why the opening scene of The Jerk is ridiculous.
Steve Martin has long been known as the wild and crazy guy, a man who redefined American comedy in the 1970s and went on to become a Hollywood icon. From his banjo-playing stand-up days to unforgettable movies like The Jerk, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and Father of the Bride, Steve Martin built a career on being both brilliant and unpredictable. To fans, he has always seemed warm, witty, and universally adored, a rare celebrity untouched by scandal. But if Hollywood teaches us anything, it's that no career is free from conflict. Even Steve Martin, with all his charm and self-deprecating humor, has had his share of rivals, grudges, and bitter co-star relationships. Behind the cameras, on movie sets, and even in his personal life, Steve sometimes found himself at odds with the very people who were supposed to be his partners. Some of these tensions ended quietly, others became Hollywood gossip, and a few left scars that Steve carried for years. Now, as Steve looks back on his extraordinary career, he's far more candid about the bumps along the way. And while he may not use the word hate in public, those close to him say there are 6 names, 6 people he could never fully forgive. Some were fellow comedians who resented his success, some were co-stars whose egos clashed with his, and at least one was a former lover whose relationship with him ended in heartbreak. This is the side of Steve Martin you've never seen before. The one who admits that being funny doesn't protect you from bitterness. And the truth is, the rivalries that shaped him may have made his comedy sharper, but they also revealed the very human struggles behind the laughter. So who were the 6? Co-stars Steve Martin hated the most? Let's find out. Steve Martin's rise to fame was as unlikely as it was meteoric. By the early 1970s, he had gone from performing quirky, banjo-fueled stand-up sets in small clubs to becoming one of the most sought-after comedians in America. His absurdist humor, his gleefully surreal punchlines, and his infamous wild and crazy guy persona made him a cultural phenomenon. But behind that rapid success, Martin was stirring envy and irritation among his peers, especially those who felt overshadowed by his unconventional approach to comedy. One of the most notable tensions was with Chevy Chase, another comedic superstar of the same era. Both men were staples of the late-night circuit, often appearing on Saturday Night Live, Steve as a frequent host and guest, Chevy as one of the original not-ready-for-prime-time players. On the surface, they appeared friendly, even collaborating on projects. But beneath the laughter was a storm of ego. Chevy, known for his sharp tongue and competitiveness, reportedly bristled at Steve's skyrocketing popularity. Chase had left SNL to pursue a movie career just as Martin's guest appearances were drawing record ratings. Hollywood insiders often described their relationship as friendly rivals, but those close to Steve admitted he never forgot Chevy's barbed comments or his tendency to belittle Steve's weird brand of comedy. Then there were the legends of the counterculture era, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. Steve admired their raw, unfiltered style, but when the three worked together, sparks flew. Belushi, in particular, was known for being both brilliant and combative. He didn't always appreciate Steve's carefully crafted absurdity, preferring the chaos of improvisation and physical comedy. While fans adored seeing them together, Steve later admitted that working alongside Belushi was a challenge. Belushi often dismissed Martin's routines as too polished, a jab that stung Steve, who prided himself on the precision of his craft. The tension became most obvious during the making of Three Amigos. In 1986, a film that paired Steve Martin with Chevy Chase and Martin Short. What was supposed to be a comedic dream team became, at times, a battle of egos. Steve had co-written the script and envisioned the project as a labor of love. But Chevy's sarcastic personality often clashed with Steve's perfectionism, while Martin Short, though generally loyal, was caught in the middle. Cast and crew later hinted that Steve often felt undermined by Chevy's dismissive attitude on set, leading to friction that never quite healed. Despite these struggles, Steve tried to maintain professionalism. He rarely lashed out in public, but friends noted that he carried grudges longer than he let on. Chevy Chase, John Belushi, and even Dan Aykroyd became names Steve associated with creative hostility, peers who could never simply be allies. While he respected their talent, he hated the way their egos interfered with collaboration. For Steve, comedy was supposed to be joyous, a celebration of the absurd and the unpredictable. But the rivalries of his early years revealed a darker truth. Success in Hollywood often breeds resentment. Every joke was a competition, every laugh a victory, and every box office success a reminder of who was on top. Steve may have been beloved by audiences, but among his fellow comedians, he was sometimes seen as an outsider, a threat, or even a rival to be cut down. And yet, these rivalries shaped him. They pushed him to refine his voice, to double down on the weirdness that made him unique, and to outlast the doubters. But privately, Steve admitted that the scars remained. Behind the grin of the wild and crazy guy was a man who never forgot the sting of being dismissed, undermined, or mocked by those he once admired. In the end, comedy wasn't just laughter, it was survival. And for Steve Martin, the rivalries that turned sour became part of the hidden list of grudges he would carry for decades. By the mid-1980s, Steve Martin had firmly transitioned from stand-up legend to bona fide movie star. Films like The Jerk, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, and All of Me had made him a household name, and Hollywood studios trusted him to carry comedies almost single-handedly. But as Steve's movie career soared, new challenges emerged. Success brought not just fame and opportunity, but also new tensions with co-stars who clashed with his style, his control, and his perfectionism. One of the most talked-about examples came during the filming of House Sitter, 1992, a romantic comedy in which Steve starred opposite Goldie Hawn. On screen, the chemistry was undeniable. Steve played a cautious architect, while Goldie brought her trademark sparkle as a con artist who pretends to be his wife. Audiences loved the pairing, but behind the scenes, it wasn't always so smooth. Goldie, an established star with her own strong comedic instincts, reportedly butted heads with Steve over timing and delivery. Steve's comedy was meticulous, crafted with the precision of a mathematician, while Goldie preferred a looser, more improvisational approach. Crew members later described days on set as a tug-of-war of punchlines. While neither ever aired their frustrations publicly, insiders claimed the tension left both stars relieved when the cameras finally stopped rolling. Even closer to home, Steve sometimes found his collaborations with Martin Short, his frequent co-star and one of his closest friends, complicated. The two met during Three Amigos and developed one of Hollywood's most enduring comedic duos, even touring together decades later. But their friendship wasn't always free of strain. Short's exuberant, over-the-top style occasionally clashed with Steve's controlled delivery. During early projects, some insiders whispered about competitiveness. Moments when Short's scene-stealing antics left Steve quietly fuming. Though they reconciled and built a lasting partnership, Steve reportedly admitted in private that their friendship had nearly buckled under the weight of creative rivalry in those early years. Another recurring source of friction was Steve's tendency to involve himself deeply in scripts and creative decisions. Unlike many actors who simply showed up and performed, Martin often co-wrote or heavily influenced the films he starred in. While this ensured his unique voice came through, it sometimes left co-stars feeling sidelined. On sets like L.A. Story and Roxanne, actors privately expressed frustration that Steve seemed to control the spotlight. For Steve, it wasn't ego, it was artistry. But for colleagues who craved equal footing, it sometimes felt suffocating. Perhaps The most surprising fallout came from his long-standing collaboration with director Carl Reiner, with whom he made The Jerk, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, and All of Me. Though the two remained respectful, there were rumors of creative disagreements, as Steve grew more confident in his writing and acting. By the late 1980s, they quietly parted ways. While Steve never publicly criticized Reiner, close friends said he regretted how their partnership fizzled, leaving behind a quiet bitterness over what might have been. In Hollywood, movie sets are often portrayed as glamorous playgrounds, but for Steve Martin, they were also battlegrounds of personality and ego. Goldie Hawn's improvisational spontaneity, Martin Short's uncontainable energy, and even directors he admired all tested his patience. To fans, these films seemed effortless, but behind every laugh was a negotiation, and behind every chemistry-filled scene was a compromise that sometimes left Steve seething. Still, Steve rarely let the public see his frustrations. His rule was simple: keep the fights behind closed doors. Yet those who knew him best said the experiences hardened him. He became cautious about who he worked with, preferring projects where he had more control over the script and production. It was not about vanity. It was about survival. He had learned that even the closest collaborators could leave scars. The list of grudges was growing, and by the early 90s, Steve had learned that the magic of Hollywood often came at the cost of broken bonds. For Steve Martin, comedy and romance often intertwined in ways that were both magical and painful. The man who could make millions laugh with absurd jokes and surreal one-liners was also, at heart, a deeply private and sensitive person. And while his career flourished in the public eye, his personal relationships sometimes collapsed in ways that left behind bitterness and regret, especially when love and work collided. The most famous example was his long relationship with Bernadette Peters, his co-star in The Jerk, 1979. The film was a milestone in Steve's career, turning him from a stand-up comedian dabbling in movies into a full-fledged leading man. Audiences adored him as Navin Johnson, the clueless optimist, and they adored Bernadette as the charming, quirky love interest. What many fans didn't know was that the romance on-screen mirrored reality. Steve and Bernadette fell in love during production and soon became one of Hollywood's most beloved couples. But behind the smiles and red carpet appearances, the relationship was fraught with challenges. Steve's perfectionism often clashed with Bernadette's free-spirited approach to both life and work. He was disciplined, cautious, always editing his jokes and polishing his scripts. She was spontaneous, intuitive, and less concerned with control. At first, the contrast attracted them. Over time, it drove them apart. When the relationship ended in the early 1980s, Steve was devastated. Friends later said he carried a quiet resentment, not toward Bernadette herself, but toward the way their love story collapsed under the pressure of fame and ambition. Working together after their breakup was nearly impossible, and the bitterness lingered for years. Romance wasn't the only area where Steve's personal life collided with professional frustration. He was known for being unusually private, often shying away from Hollywood parties and publicity events. Some co-stars interpreted this as aloofness, even arrogance. While Steve thought of himself as shy, others took offense, believing he thought he was above the usual Hollywood social scene. This misperception led to strained relationships with actors and actresses who felt snubbed or excluded. Though Steve rarely addressed it directly, he later admitted that his introversion sometimes cost him friendships. Another source of tension was Steve's perfectionism. He approached comedy like a scientist, dissecting jokes, rehearsing endlessly, and controlling the rhythm of every scene. For co-stars who preferred a looser, more collaborative style, this could feel stifling. Some actresses whispered that Steve was difficult to work with because he left little room for improvisation. For Steve, it wasn't ego. It was a desire to create flawless comedy. But for those on the other side of the camera, It sometimes felt like they were being micromanaged. The heartbreak with Bernadette Peters was particularly formative. In later interviews, Steve admitted that the breakup left him questioning his own worth, both as a partner and as a performer. He hated himself for not being able to balance love and career, for letting ambition overshadow intimacy. That self-directed anger became one of the defining battles of his life. It fueled his art but also haunted him in quieter moments when the laughter faded. There were other strained relationships, too. Short-lived romances that ended abruptly, friendships that soured when Steve's career took precedence, and creative partners who resented his relentless drive. Each one added another layer to the list of grudges, not all directed outward. For Steve, some of the harshest hatred was reserved for himself, for the mistakes he made, for the relationships he couldn't sustain, and for the moments when his quest for comedic perfection came at a personal cost. Hollywood is full of stories, of broken hearts and professional clashes, but in Steve Martin's case, the two often overlapped. His romances became part of his work affected his romances, and when things went wrong, the bitterness ran deep. For a man who appeared so effortlessly funny, the reality was often painful. Love brought joy, but it also brought betrayals that left Steve scarred. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Steve had weathered not only rivalries and professional clashes, but also heartbreaks that shaped his worldview. And while audiences saw a smiling star, the man behind the grin was still tallying a private list of the people and the mistakes he could never quite forgive. By the time Steve Martin reached the peak of his fame in the 1990s and 2000s, he had become more than a comedian. He was a Hollywood institution. With best-selling books, hit films, Grammy-winning bluegrass albums, and even plays to his name, Steve seemed untouchable. Yet behind the accolades and the carefully polished public image was a private tally. 6 people who had tested his patience, wounded his pride, or left a mark so deep that, even decades later, Steve couldn't quite let it go. The first name on that list was Goldie Hawn, his co-star in House Sitter. While Steve respected Goldie's talent and box office draw, their clashing approaches to comedy made the filming a tense experience. Goldie loved spontaneity and improvisation, while Steve wanted precision. For audiences, their chemistry sparkled, but Steve privately admitted that working with her was like constantly fighting for rhythm. It wasn't hatred in the traditional sense, it was artistic frustration that hardened into bitterness. Second was Martin Short, a name that might surprise fans since the two are now close friends and frequent collaborators. Yet in the early years of their partnership, Steve struggled with Short's scene-stealing energy. Short's larger-than-life personality sometimes overshadowed Steve's carefully crafted timing. While their friendship eventually deepened and healed, insiders say Steve quietly resented Short for years, and that tension nearly destroyed one of comedy's most beloved duos before it truly began. Third was Bernadette Peters, the woman Steve once loved. Their breakup wasn't simply personal. It affected his work, his sense of stability, and his confidence. Steve never spoke publicly against Bernadette, but friends said the heartbreak lingered like a shadow. It wasn't hatred directed at her as a person, but rather at the pain the relationship left behind. In Steve's private tally, she was 1 of the 6 because she represented a wound that never fully healed. Fourth was Chevy Chase, his co-star in Three Amigos. Known for his sarcasm and difficult personality, Chevy reportedly clashed with both Steve and Martin Short during production. Steve found Chevy's arrogance grating and his unreliability frustrating. While the film became a cult classic, insiders recalled that the set was rife with tension, with Steve often stepping in to smooth over Chevy's outbursts. Steve later joked lightly about their differences, but those who knew him said the resentment was real and long-lasting. The 5th name on Steve's list was less expected. A Hollywood executive who meddled in the production of The Man with Two, Brains, and other projects. Steve, who valued creative control, hated being told to tone down his absurdist humor for broader audiences. Studio interference left him furious, and though he rarely named names, he often hinted in interviews that some of his greatest frustrations weren't with actors, but with executives who stifled his creativity. Those executives represented an enemy far more insidious than a rival comedian. They were a reminder that even at the height of his fame, he wasn't fully in control. And finally, the sixth was himself. More than anyone else, Steve carried a deep-seated resentment toward his own flaws, his perfectionism, his shyness, his inability to balance love and work. Friends often